The story of Esther Carter, when justice came boiling hot. Cypress Bend Plantation, just outside Baton Rouge, Louisiana, November 28, 1867. It's Thanksgiving Day in the American South. Inside the main house, Colonel William Rutledge and his 3 sons are getting ready for their big feast. They're laughing loudly, drinking whiskey, and waiting for the golden turkey that Esther, their house cook, is supposed to be making. But they have no idea what's really happening in the kitchen. Pork fat is bubbling in a heavy iron pot. But it's not for cooking their dinner, it's for them. In just a few hours, the colonel and his 3 sons will be dead, burned alive in the same oil that should have cooked their meal. And it all started with a daughter who was sold, a past that was hidden, and a pain that never went away. Esther stirs the pot with steady hands, but her eyes are watching the big house. Inside, the men are making plans for tomorrow. Outside, she's planning their end. This is the story of Esther Carter, the cook who served revenge hot on Thanksgiving Day and made a house built on lies burn from the inside out. Before we continue, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there, and don't forget to hit the like button. The kitchen at Cypress Bend never rested. Not the night before Thanksgiving. Wood cracked in the fireplace like bones breaking. Iron pots hissed under the weight of boiling fat. The air was heavy with the smell of spices, vinegar, sweat, and something else. Something older, something waiting. Esther moved through the smoke like she belonged there, bare feet on wooden floors, cloth wrapped around her wrists, eyes sharp and calm. She stirred, chopped, seasoned, and tasted, but her mind wasn't on the food. It was on the door. It always came back to the door. That awful sound of metal hinges creaking, that explosion of lay, utter from men who never knocked. It had been years, but Esther could still hear it, every time William Rutledge's sons came home, and tonight they were coming back again for the feast. Cypress Bend had changed its name, not its heart. The war had ended 2 years ago. The newspapers said the South was being rebuilt. But on this land, once covered in sugarcane and blood, the old ways hung on like thick moss. The Rutledge family still ruled. They just didn't call it slavery anymore. Now they called it work. They paid pennies for 10 hours, punished with fists and starvation, and called it progress. William Rutledge sat in the big house drinking bourbon, wearing a Union pin on his coat, the same coat stained by whips and women's screams. And his sons, they wore nice suits now, but Esther remembered their faces when they were boys, and she remembered what they did when no one was watching. The oldest, Nathaniel, once dragged a field girl by her hair into the cane. The middle one, Thomas, used to spit in the food Esther cooked if he thought it smelled too African. And the youngest, Silas, had a laugh that could empty out a person's soul. He was the one who told her with that evil grin that her daughter was gone north, sold to a better life. Esther never saw her baby again. Now 30 years had passed. The kitchen had grown older, quieter, but the ghosts had not. Outside, a wagon rolled over stones. Dogs barked in the distance. Boots stomped on wooden steps. The door opened. 3 men walked in, dressed in fine wool and arrogance. Esther didn't move. She kept stirring the pot, eyes fixed on the dancing oil. "Well, look who's still alive," Nathaniel said slowly, pulling off his gloves. "Esther, the cook, older than the damn stove." Thomas laughed. "She's still seasoning with roots and voodoo, I bet." Silas said nothing. He just walked to the kitchen table and ran it, his fingers over a carving in the wood. A little flower burned into the edge. Esther had carved it there with a nail the day her daughter was born. He smiled and pressed his thumb into it hard. "You ready to feed us, Auntie?" he whispered, not looking at her. Esther turned. For the first time that night, she looked Silas in the eye. And in that look, something passed between them, like a storm building far off over the swamp. She said only this, "Y'all eating real good this year?" Then she went back to her pot, and the oil bubbled louder. Long before she was Esther the cook, she was just Essie, barefoot in the mud behind the kitchen house, catching fireflies in her mother's apron. She learned early not to speak loud, not to run too fast, not to dream with her eyes open. The fields could see that, and the fields had eyes. Her mother, Binta, came from the coast, Senegal, they said, though no one really knew. She carried stories in her bones and the weight of lost names in her breath. Mama never cried. She only hummed deep old songs while she stirred the soup, scrubbed the floor, wiped Essie's back after punishment. "When the pot boils," she used to say, "you don't scream, you wait, you watch, then you feed it what it needs." Essie was 12 when the first scar came. Not from a whip, from silence. She watched her father, Jonas, dragged through the sugar cane before dawn. Accused of stealing a tin of molasses, they tied him to the iron cross behind the smokehouse, the same one used for curing pork. They left him there bleeding into the dirt for 2 days. On the third, a boy named Silas Rutledge threw rocks at his body. Esther was made to serve breakfast to the guests that morning. She didn't cry, she watched. By 15, she was a woman in every way that mattered on the plantation. The kitchen was her prison and her protection. They said she had the hands, meaning the seasoning, the smell, the instinct. But cooking wasn't just survival, it was resistance. She learned how to cut meat so fine it fell apart with a breath. She learned which herbs eased pain, which made it worse. She learned what lard did at 375 degrees. And above all, she learned how to look a man in the face and make him believe she was nothing. That was her mother's final lesson. She named her daughter Clara after the woman who once tried to run and almost made it. Clara was light-skinned, bright-eyed, and curious. Too curious. When Clara turned 7, a letter came from New Orleans. William Rutledge needed to settle a debt. The girl was sold into apprenticeship, he said. No one called it what it was, but Esther knew. She screamed that night. Not in front of the masters. No, she walked into the swamp and screamed until the frogs went quiet. When she returned, her hair was soaked and her hands were bleeding. She cooked anyway. A stew, spicy, thick, and red. No one noticed the difference. Years passed. The war came and went. Men in gray, men in blue. None of them changed Cypress Bend. The name of slavery changed, but the hunger stayed. So did Esther. She stayed because leaving meant forgetting, and she refused to forget. She fed the men who killed her past. She stirred their joy, salted their greed, roasted their cruelty, and every time she saw the sons grow, Nathaniel with his fists, Thomas with his hate, Silas with his teeth, she remembered what was taken and what still could be given. On the night before the feast, as the men laughed in the parlor and brandy flowed like honey, Esther sat alone in the dark kitchen. She held a wooden spoon in one hand. In the other, she held a blade no longer than her finger. Her mother's knife wrapped in cloth. She remembered the day Binta placed it in her palm and whispered, "When the time comes, don't flinch. Fire needs feeding." Esther pressed the knife to her chest and closed her eyes. She didn't flinch. Thanksgiving morning broke slow and humid, the kind of air that sticks to your skin and listens to your breath. Cypress trees stood like mourners around the plantation, their roots tangled in secrets. The swamp beyond steamed like a pot. Inside the big house, polished boots tapped across the hardwood. The Rutledge sons, dressed in fine coats and loud voices. The slaves, now called workers, though nothing had changed, moved like shadows, eyes down, hands fast. Esther Carter stood at the center of the kitchen, a storm hidden inside calm. The table was set to shame God. Silverware gleamed like unsheathed knives. Roasted chickens were stuffed and spiced. Sweet potatoes glazed in molasses. Cornbread stacked high. And in the center, the centerpiece, a great brass kettle filled with golden lard meant for deep frying the turkey. The men were drunk before noon. Nathaniel, sweating and red-faced, bragged about his railroad contracts up north. Thomas boasted of re-educating freed men in Mississippi, teaching them how to behave like they still had chains. Silas barely spoke, content to watch. His eyes drifted often toward Esther as she moved between the dining hall and the kitchen. She could feel it, that stare, the same look he gave her when he told her Clara was gone. Esther's movements were measured, every dish served with care, every word silent. She poured wine with one hand and stirred the lard with the other. Outside, the sun climbed. Inside, the air thickened. When Thomas made a crude joke about how Esther must have made that turkey from one of her cousins, the others laughed, loud and long. Esther didn't blink. She returned to the kitchen and added more wood to the fire beneath the lard. The flames kissed the brass and the oil began to roll, thick, bubbling, singing its low, hot song. Nathaniel entered the kitchen first. "Need a hand, old girl," he sneered, lifting too. He lit from one of the pots. Don't want you keeling over before the meal's done." He reached for the handle of the kettle. Esther's hand landed on his wrist. Her grip was like stone. Their eyes met. "You don't touch what you don't understand," she said. For a moment, the kitchen went quiet. Even the oil hushed. Then Nathaniel chuckled, pulled his hand back, and walked out, muttering something about uppity cooks. Esther turned back to the lard. It was nearly ready. The scent was no longer just fat and fire. It smelled like judgment. From the parlor, Silas called out, "Esther, bring us the turkey, will you? Let's see what you've done with our bird." She didn't answer. She picked up the carving knife, the long fork, and the thick padded gloves. Behind her, the brass kettle hissed, trembled, and waited. The fire beneath the brass kettle had gone from hungry to starving. The lard inside swirled like molten gold, thick and bubbling, the kind of boil that whispered promises. Esther stood before it, her back to the door, her face lit orange by the flames. In her hands, she held two things, a long wooden paddle and a memory that would not let go. She wasn't thinking of turkey anymore. She was thinking of Clara. The knife she carried wasn't for carving, it was for settling scores. Every inch of the kitchen had become a weapon. The iron ladles, the skewers, the cast iron skillet she'd wielded like a shield for 30 years. The pantry door creaked behind her and she glanced back just once at the shelf where Binta's old spice jars still sat. Cinnamon, cayenne, asafoetida, things that made you remember. Silas entered first. No knock, no warning, just that same cocky walk and cold smile. He leaned against the doorframe and sniffed the air like a man sniffing wine. Smells like tradition," he said. Esther didn't turn. She just kept stirring the lard slow and steady. "Where's the turkey, Auntie?" he asked. "You hiding it under your apron?" She heard his footsteps behind her. 4 steps, then silence, a 5th step right beside her. He reached to lift the kettle's lid. Esther moved like smoke and steel. The wooden paddle cracked across his face with the sound of splitting bone. He staggered back, gasping, hand to his mouth. "You broke," he started, but Esther didn't let him finish. She grabbed the thick gloves, gripped the kettle by its iron handles, and in one motion, strong, practiced, final, tilted it. The boiling lard spilled forward like judgment. It caught Silas from the chest down. His scream shattered the room. He didn't fall, not at first. He stumbled back, legs blistering, arms flailing, mouth open in a scream that turned into steam. Then he dropped, twitching, sizzling. Esther stood over him, eyes wide, chest heaving, the empty kettle still in her hands. One down. Upstairs, Nathaniel and Thomas heard the noise. Chairs scraped, boots hit floorboards, shouts echoed through the hallway. "She's lost her mind! Get the rifle!" But Esther didn't run. She stepped over the twitching body, grabbed the carving knife, and walked to the pantry. She opened it calmly and pulled out another pot of lard she'd hidden hours before, covered and waiting just in case. The scream hadn't even finished echoing through the rafters when Nathaniel barreled down the stairs, rifle in hand, rage on his breath. Thomas followed, holding a fireplace poker, his face pale beneath the false bravery. Neither of them asked if Silas was dead. They knew. Esther stood in the doorway of the kitchen, calm as the grave. Her apron was streaked with lard and blood, her hands bare now, the kettle empty beside her. Smoke curled at her feet like it knew the way. "You crazy bitch!" Nathaniel roared, raising the rifle, but he was trembling. Esther didn't flinch. "Put that down," she said softly, "or I'll feed you what your brothers tasted. Sing now." He hesitated. Thomas took a step back. Nathaniel aimed, but not well. The gun fired wide, the shot tearing through a shelf of dried beans. Esther moved fast, slipping behind the cast iron stove. Sparks flew, the smell of gunpowder mixed with grease. Thomas turned to run. Esther was already on him. She tackled him at the pantry threshold, knocking the poker from his hand. He hit the floor hard. Before he could scramble, she brought the carving knife down, not into his chest, but into the space between his fingers. It pinned his hand to the floor. He screamed. "You remember Clara?" she hissed, inches from his face. He didn't answer, just cried and shook. Esther leaned closer. "She was 7, and you let them take her. You watched." His eyes bulged. He tried to speak. Esther twisted the knife. "I did too," she said, her voice breaking. "And I've been tasting that silence ever since." Footsteps, heavy, desperate. Nathaniel returned, now wielding the rifle like a club. Esther yanked the knife free and rolled aside just as the butt came down, splintering the pantry floor. She kicked at Thomas's knee, breaking it with a wet crack. He howled. Nathaniel lunged. She ducked behind the stove again. He followed. Esther grabbed the second pot, cold for now, and smashed it into his face. The edge caught him across the temple. He dropped the rifle. Blood ran down his cheek, thick and fast. They wrestled. She wasn't stronger, but she was precise. She drove her thumb into his eye, biting his arm when he tried to choke her. He shrieked. She kneed him in the groin. When he fell to his knees, gasping, she didn't stop. She grabbed the iron skimmer, flat, wide, made for fish, and slammed it into his mouth again and again and again until teeth scattered like dry corn across the floor. Silence returned, slow and heavy. Both brothers groaned on the ground. Esther stood over the M, panting, hair soaked, arms shaking, but not from fear, from memory. She looked around the kitchen one last time at the pots, the ladles, the blood, and then she whispered, "This is the only gratitude I ever owed you." The light in the kitchen had changed, not the sun. It was still hours from rising, but the light from the fire, it burned with a different color now, a deeper orange, like the edge of a dying star. The scent of scorched oil mixed with singed fabric and blistered flesh. It coated the walls, sank into the floorboards, curled beneath fingernails. The scream that had split the air minutes before had already been swallowed by the silence that followed, but its echo lived in the bones of the house. Esther Carter stood still, her shadow painted against the soot-dark wall. The kettle lay on its side near Silas Rutledge's twitching body. The fat had hissed its final note, and now the room was filled with a deep, almost holy quiet. Esther didn't move toward him. She didn't need to. The work was done. His face was unrecognizable, the skin of his neck and chest lifting away like parchment in fire, his lips no longer able to form threats or smirks or lies. She stepped around him as if stepping over a snake, cautious, but not afraid. She had dreamed of this, not with clarity, not with fantasy, but with rhythm. The same rhythm that pulsed in her hands as she stirred pots over the years. The same rhythm that held her upright during countless nights of grief. The same rhythm her mother had hummed while peeling yams and hiding bruises. It was a rhythm older than rage, a rhythm of return. Nathaniel was the first to respond. She heard the gunshot before she saw him, the bullet biting into the pantry door just inches from her shoulder. The blast tore through the house, rattling silverware and driving crows up from the fields. She dropped low instinctively and felt the splinters graze her cheek. The second son had come armed. "Esther!" he shouted, his voice shrill, cracking. "You goddamn witch! What did you do?" She didn't answer. Her eyes were already scanned, scanning the room, locking onto what she needed. The long iron skimmer hanging on the wall. The second pot of lard she'd hidden behind the flour sacks. The carving knife still dripping near Thomas's hand. She moved like smoke, quiet, intentional, leaving no trace behind, but heat. Nathaniel came barreling through the doorway, rifle raised like a club now. His first shot wasted in panic. His boots were slick with oil. He stumbled. She rose as he swung, the butt of the gun sweeping toward her ribs. But she caught the motion in time and ducked under it, ramming her shoulder into his gut. He grunted, reeled back. She grabbed the skimmer and drove it into his mouth. It made a sound like splitting melon. Teeth scattered across the floor. He dropped the gun, clutching his face, howling. Esther didn't stop. She swung again into his cheek, his temple, the base of his neck. The iron bent, then cracked. Blood sprayed in arcs. He collapsed into a heap beside Silas. Thomas, hearing the crash, appeared at the edge of the hall like a child lost in fog. His hand was still bandaged from where she'd pinned it with the carving knife. His leg dragged behind him, bent at an unnatural angle. He looked at her wide-eyed, face pale. "Esther," he whispered. She didn't let him finish. She crossed the room in 3 strides and punched the heel of her hand into his sternum. He fell backwards, hitting the kitchen table. A bowl of candied yams clattered to the ground, the syrup mixing with blood on the floor. "I remember what you said when Clara was taken," she muttered. "You said she was lucky. You said she'd be safer somewhere else." Thomas coughed, his mouth filled with blood. "You said I should be grateful." She pulled the second pot from the hearth. It wasn't fully hot yet, but it would do. She stepped forward and upended it over his legs. The oil didn't scream like before. It groaned as I Tired of the work. Thomas did scream. It was a short, choked thing. Then silence again. She lit no fire. She had no need for heat. The swamp was thick with its own warmth, and she didn't need light to see. Inside her sat the memory of 3 faces, twisted now, broken, disfigured by oil and iron, and the truth they never thought would find them. That was enough light. She sat with her knees pulled to her chest, her bag beside her, fingers working the thread of the cloth wrapped around her daughter's old handkerchief. Her eyes were open, but she wasn't seeing the trees. She was seeing the kitchen. She was seeing Silas's face, how it changed the moment he realized she wasn't afraid, how his smirk melted before the oil touched him. She remembered the way his mouth had twisted, the noise he made, not like a man, but like something cornered, exposed, undone. She had waited so long for that, and it hadn't brought peace. Not yet. The next morning, the dogs came. She heard them long before she saw them yelping, panting, growling. Their handlers not far behind. Men shouting orders, breaking through brush, the clink of shackles ready at their belts. They weren't just hunting her, they were hunting the story. They needed to erase it before it spread. They needed to call her mad, dangerous, evil, because they couldn't afford the truth. The truth was what scared them. She was a woman with no weapon but fire and memory. And she had won. That couldn't be allowed. Esther didn't run. She folded the handkerchief carefully, tucked it back into the satchel, and stood. Her bones ached. Her feet were swollen. But her spirit was something else now. Not just a mother, not just a cook. She was history walking. She left the clearing before the dogs reached it. She moved deeper into water, waist deep, where the snakes watched but did not strike. The cypress roots reached like hands, guiding her path, and the names kept coming. She whispered them, each one a prayer. Ach, one a blade. Isaiah, Ruthie, Matilda, Esther, she said finally, tasting her own name. Not as a title, not as a tool, but as a verdict. When she emerged from the swamp 2 nights later, it was under the shroud of Spanish moss and moonlight. A small cabin stood at the edge of the tree line, leaning, quiet, candle flickering in the window. It wasn't safe, nowhere was, but it was known. Inside lived Mother Dina, an old healer who had buried 3 husbands and outlived a dozen masters. No one asked her age. No one questioned her wisdom. Some said she'd once hexed a white man until he lost his tongue. Others said she simply waited for people to poison themselves with their own cruelty. Esther knocked once. The door opened without a word. Dina took one look at her, oil-streaked, barefoot, eyes full of ghosts, and stepped aside. "You finally did it," she said, not as a question, but as prophecy fulfilled. Esther nodded. "I did." Dina closed the door behind her. Inside, the air smelled of sulfur and mint. Herbs hung from the beams. A kettle simmered on the stove, not of lard, but of something sweeter. Esther sat on a low stool. Her limbs felt like wood, but her chest had never breathed deeper. "They'll come looking," Dina said. "They already are. You ready to keep walking?" Esther looked up, eyes shining, but dry. "I got names to carry still." Dina handed her a piece of cloth, old, frayed, dark with age and smoke. On it were stitched dozens of names in red thread, some crooked, some barely legible. "Add yours," she said. "Ain't no shame in the blood if the hand that spilled it held the truth." Esther took the needle, threaded it slow, and carved her name in red, one name at a time. Outside, dogs barked in the distance. Somewhere, a gate slammed shut. The sun had not yet touched the sky, but the air was thick with coming light. Esther stood amid the carnage, her hands shaking now, not with fear, but with memory. It was done. The house moaned under its own weight. The kitchen, once a place of order and repetition, had become something else, a sanctuary, a site of reckoning. The great house, the proud estate of Cypress Bend, had swallowed generations whole. But tonight it had tasted resistance. She could hear the voices rising now outside in the fields, in the quarters, workers stirring early, overseers noticing the silence from the house, men who would soon rush to avenge what they could not comprehend. She didn't wait. Esther moved quickly with the discipline of years. She went to the pantry and pulled up the loose floorboard she'd loosened the night before. From beneath it, she took the satchel she'd buried, wrapped in cloth and tied with twine. Inside, a few coins, a broken pendant once worn by her mother, a handkerchief with Clara's initials embroidered in shaking thread, and a strip of cloth stained with lye from the day her brother was burned. She tied the bag across her back and took one last look at the kitchen. The floor was a mess of food and blood and smoke. The silver serving trays gleamed in the firelight. The carved roast sat untouched, a grotesque monument to false gratitude. She walked through the parlor, past the portraits of the Rutledge family, past the oak table where her daughter had once been sold, past the grand piano no one knew how to play. The door creaked open with a groan that felt like a sigh. Outside, the air hit her like a second birth, cold, wet, honest. She moved fast into the trees, down the side path, past the old well, through the cane rows that still reeked of blood and thunder, into the marsh where only the desperate survived and only the faithful endured. Behind her, the house stood still. It would not burn. She'd thought of that, but no, fire was not her legacy. The silence would be louder. The Rutledge name would not end in flames. It would rot in the minds of those who found what she left behind. The first scream had come from them. The last word belonged to her. The swamp had its own language, not the human tongue. No, it spoke in fog and breath, and the long, slow groan of trees shifting in their ancient beds. It whispered in the slap of water against rotted cypress roots, in the rustle of snakes through damp grass, in the hush of birds that had seen too much. Esther moved through it like she belonged. Her bare feet knew where to step. Her eyes caught the smallest signs, mud curling in the wrong direction, reeds parting where no wind had passed. She had been in these woods many times before, not as a fugitive, but as a woman grieving, a woman needing silence, a woman needing to remember. Now she was not hiding, she was returning. Each step carried the weight of names, names of people no one wrote down, names of men whose backs had been turned into maps of pain, names of women who birthed babies in fields and buried them in secret, names of children who vanished in wagons taken north or nowhere. Esther whispered them as she walked. Jonas, Clara, Old Moses, Binta. She said each name like an offering, like a drumbeat, like a chain being pulled tighter with each syllable. Her voice didn't rise above a breath, but in the dark hush of the swamp, it might as well have been thunder. She found shelter in a place no white man would dare go, a raised patch of land half sunk between two forked oaks. There had once been a hut there, long gone now, collapsed under moss and time, but the bones remained. She cleared the space with her hands, moving slow, reverent, as if disturbing a grave. Maybe she was. They found the bodies 3 days later. Silas, blistered and bloated, still lay curled beside the brass kettle, mouth open as if mid-prayer or curse. Nathaniel had bled into the cracks of the floorboards, his jaw shattered, face swollen beyond recognition. Thomas clung to life for a while longer, but when the doctor arrived from Baton Rouge, he simply stared at the man, whispered Esther once, and slipped into a silence he would never return from. The plantation froze, the laughter stopped, the horses refused the reins, the wind no longer passed through the cane in song. Something had broken inside Cypress Bend, not a crime, not a scandal, a curse. They sent for Colonel William Rutledge the same day the doctor left. He arrived at dusk, gray-bearded, stiff, smelling of horse and tobacco. His coat was black, his gloves were white. He looked at his house like it was a stranger, like the front porch should have bowed in apology. No one greeted him. The servants had vanished into the woods. The overseers wouldn't come near the kitchen. He walked in alone, and the house swallowed him. The colonel didn't weep. He stood at the edge of the parlor where Silas used to play cards and drink bourbon he hadn't earned. He walked the hallway where Thomas had carved his initials into the floorboards with a stolen knife. He entered the bedroom where Nathaniel once beat a man until his back looked like river rock. He didn't weep. Instead, he sat in the kitchen. That kitchen lit a cigar and stared at the blackened kettle. It still smelled faintly of lard and something deeper. The floor beneath it was scorched. The stone was cracked. Esther's apron lay nearby, folded neatly, as if it had resigned. He took a long drag and exhaled into the rafters. She was just a cook, he muttered. Just a goddamn cook. But the words didn't feel right. They echoed strangely, bounced back off the soot. Covered walls with weight, with judgment, because he knew she hadn't just boiled his sons, she'd boiled the lie. The lie of civility, of control, of ownership. The lie that said the kitchen was his domain, that loyalty could be bought with scraps, that quiet meant consent. Esther had taken everything he built and left it scalded in a brass pot. By midnight, the colonel had drunk a full bottle of whiskey. He didn't sleep. He paced. He yelled at the walls. He screamed her name into the parlor. Esther, as if she might walk back in and undo it all, but the house remained still. Around 3 a.m., he did something no one expected. He entered the kitchen barefoot, shirtless, wild-eyed. He dragged the kettle back to the hearth, lit a new fire beneath it, filled it with lard from the cellar, barrels meant for another feast, another Thanksgiving that would never come. He set the iron spoon on the hook. He waited, and as the oil began to heat, the house began to change. It creaked, it moaned, it remembered. They found him the next day, kneeling before the fire. The lard had boiled dry. The skin on his face was cracked with blisters. He hadn't poured it over himself. He had simply knelt there, staring, hands raw, eyes wide open, dead. The newspapers said it was grief, said Esther had escaped after a sudden and violent madness. They printed no image. They wrote no warning, but the workers in the fields told another version. They said the colonel had heard her voice in the walls, heard her footsteps in the pantry. They said she came back not in flesh, but in flame, and that he saw every name he'd ever tried to erase, written in smoke on the kitchen walls. Esther never returned to Cypress Bend, but the kitchen never cooled again. The house was left to rot. And they say that every November when the moon is full and the trees are still, you can hear the oil hiss and someone whitte, spearing from the fire. Just a cook, huh, son? Saying he'd clean up the mess and restore order. Said the house was too fine to leave behind. Said the cane would rise again if someone with a strong back and a stronger whip took the reins. But when he stepped inside the kitchen, he vomited. He said it was the smell, lard gone sour, mold thick on the walls, rats nesting in the rafters. But others knew better. The smell wasn't rot, it was memory. A memory that clung to iron pots and scorched wood like sweat on skin. The same memory that made the floor feel soft beneath your feet like it might give way and swallow you. The same memory that made the air inside thick, like it had lungs of its own, like it was waiting to breathe again. No one stayed the night. Not the man from St. Francisville, not the crew he brought, not the boys with rifles hired to patrol the edge of the fields. They all left before sundown, silent and pale. Some never came back. Some pretended they'd never gone. The house was cursed, they whispered, but no one said her name, not out loud, because they knew Esther Carter wasn't a ghost. She was a reckoning. In the quarters, though, the story grew quiet at first, passed between old women stirring pots, between boys hiding from lashes, between field hands who didn't believe in salvation, but believed in signs. It wasn't just what she did, it was how she did it. She didn't run screaming, she didn't poison the food or slip away in the night. She waited, she watched, and then she cooked them. That was the part that hit hardest. The fire wasn't rage, it was ritual. She fed them what they had fed her world for generations. Pain, silence, heat, and justice, one boiling breath at a time. Years passed. The war was a scar no one looked at anymore. The land was tired, the cane thinner each sea, sun. Cypress Bend never recovered. Not from the killings, not from the curse. They tried to lease it out, sell it, rename it. Nothing stuck. Every time someone tried to farm the land, accidents happened. Men drowned in dry ditches. Oxen dropped dead in harness. Women miscarried in the shadow of the old smokehouse. They buried the Rutledge name under layers of silence, but the roots were still there, tangled and red. And somewhere beyond the edge of that cursed plantation, beyond the groves of choking willow and the paths, only the old ones remembered Esther lived. Or so they said. No one could prove it. No one dared search for her. But sometimes deep in the swamp, hunters would claim they saw a woman walking across still water alone, hair wrapped in cloth, skin burned but proud, holding a wooden spoon like a scepter. She would vanish into mist before they could call out, and if they were wise, they wouldn't call out at all. One night, decades later, a young girl in Opelousas asked her grandmother if the story of Esther the cook was true. The old woman leaned close, her eyes glassy with the weight of too many funerals. "She was real," she said. "As real as the hands on your arms, as real as fire, as real as every lie they told us in that house." "Did she die?" the girl asked. The grandmother smiled. "Not exactly. She became what? A name they can't bury, a truth they can't swallow." Some said Esther went further south, crossed the Sabine, changed her name, lived among Creoles who didn't ask questions, and cooked for families who never knew the heat in her hands. Others said she joined a maroon village deep in the swamp where no white man dared tread and became a kind of queen, silent, watchful, deadly with a kettle. And some swore she never left the woods at all. They said she became something else, not spirit, not demon, a warning, a story sharpened into steel, a whispered truth passed down between the cracks of history through the mouths of those who survived. They said that every time a man lifted his hand to beat a woman, he would pause just for a breath, because something in the back of his mind would whisper, "Esther's watching." They said that every field still echoes with the faint scent of smoke each November, and that somewhere in some lonely kitchen where the pots hiss and the fire burns too clean, you might feel her standing behind you, not to hurt you, just to see, to make sure the heat stays honest. The old one said she was still out there, not in the way of flesh maybe, but in something deeper. In the way fire behaves when it licks too close to injustice. In the way lard hisses in a pot when the wrong man walks in. In the way silence falls hard when someone tells a lie too close to history. She had become a rhythm now, a heat, a story no bullet could kill, no law could cage, no preacher could wash away. And though her name was never written in ledgers or carved into stone, it was etched into the air of every place where someone dared to say enough. There was a boy, years later, skin dark like burnt sugar, who worked in the kitchen of a white family in Mississippi. He was quiet, fast with his hands, slow with his eyes. The mistress called him boy, and the master called him mute. But one day when the man of the house raised a belt to the cook for dropping a pot, the boy stepped forward, steady and calm, and before he said anything else he said, "My mama told me about Esther." That belt never landed. That man never raised it again. There was a woman in Alabama who stirred her grits with a heavy wooden spoon passed down from her great-grandmother. The handle was cracked, the grain smooth from decades of use, and each time she turned the spoon, she whispered something, not a prayer, not a curse, just a name, Esther. And her children grew strong and her house stayed warm and no man ever dared come through her key. Itching with lies on his breath. They wrote books about generals. They made statues for thieves. They built museums to honor those who never bled. But they left no place for Esther Carter. They couldn't because she didn't ask. She didn't plead. She didn't wait for justice in a court that never called her name. She boiled it with her own hands and fed it to the empire. Time moved on. The house at Cypress Bend sank slowly into the earth, taken back by moss and rot and memory. The fields lay fallow, the sugarcane gone wild, growing crooked like it remembered every scream. Tourists came, sometimes snapping photos from the road. No one got too close. And once a year, always around Thanksgiving, someone left a bundle of herbs. They said that every time a man lifted his hand to beat a woman, he would pause, rosemary just for a breath, because something in the back of his mind would whisper, "No one ever saw who left watching," but everyone knew what it meant. They said that every field still echoes with the faint scent of smoke each November, and that somewhere in some lonely kitchen where the pots hiss and the fire burns too clean, you might feel her standing behind you, not to hurt you, just to see, to make sure the heat stays honest. The old one said she was still out there, smoking, not in the way of flesh maybe, but in something deeper, in the way fire behaves when it licks too close to injustice, in the way lard hisses in a pot because the wrong man was never meant to be forgotten, in the way silence falls hard when someone tells a lie too close to history. She had become a rhythm now, is also a heat, a story no bullet could kill, leave your mark, no law could cage, share this truth no preacher could wash away, never heard the name Esther Carter.